Leaving the precinct was not my decision. Ultimately, the city had other plans for the building and relented to severe public pressure.
Well, that was Seattle Police Chief Carmen Best speaking about the decision to abandon the 13th police precinct in Seattle. City leadership failed the police department, and a group of radicals have now taken over downtown Seattle. Ladies and gentlemen, the city is under siege. From who you ask? Peaceful protesters. These so-called peaceful protesters, and I'm saying that lightly, have created a 6-block autonomous zone made of, guess what? Armed citizen patrols who, by the way, have taken over the very police station and are now enforcing their own set of laws. They are encouraging other protesters to camp within the zone, and that's not all. Rapper Raz Simone, I'm not really sure who that is accused of being warlord in Seattle's police-free CHAZ, which is an acronym for Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. I wonder if they're going to get their own zip code one of these days. So while we all recognize that Seattle is definitely on the liberal side of the spectrum, it's still shocking to know that these Democratic elected officials would allow these so-called peaceful protesters to occupy city streets as if they're an elected sovereign authority. I wonder if they're going to, allow them to have elections and open schools and all the stuff the city would do. But seriously, here's a question many of us are asking. Why aren't the cops allowed to enforce the law? Joining us to discuss it, host of the Andrew Klavan Show, Andrew Klavan, and editor-in-chief of the National Memo, Joe Conason. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Nice to be here.
So let me just play one more piece of sound from Police Chief Carmen Best and get you to listen to what's going on the ground there.
We have heard that there are armed people patrolling the streets near 12th and Pine. We've also received report that these armed people may be demanding payment from business owners in exchange for some of that protection. We've also heard that they may be demanding to see identification from people who live in the area. This is not legal.
Andrew, you literally have the police chief. I mean, that almost sounds like a call that should be going to the police, not a briefing coming from the police, right? They are talking about the city that they have lost that is now under the control of armed protesters, their own precinct. The thing that I want to add that I find amazing, Andrew, is all week long, in fact, for 2 weeks, I've heard about peaceful protest, peaceful protest, peaceful protest. And yet the media it's almost like they don't want you to know what's happening in Seattle because they keep using this phrase. And when you have armed people that now control 6 city blocks, including City Hall and a precinct, that doesn't sound too peaceful to me, Andrew.
Well, they didn't take it over by peaceful means. They took it over by assaulting the police day after day until the mayor pulled the police out. So it's not a peaceful protest at all. The entire concept of mostly peaceful kind of reminds me of, my wife was mostly peaceful till she killed me. It's not how often, it's not the percentage of peacefulness. It's what you do with the violence. There's no surprise what's going to happen here. There's no surprise if left alone, radicals unpoliced will devolve. There will be rapes. There are going to be, people with guns oppressing people without guns. This is what always happens throughout history. The question is what to do now. I mean, the question is, do you go in with armed force and take them out, as is the custom from Fort Sumter to Waco, or do you let them play out what is going to be, I think, obviously a disaster? And I have to say, kind of in my heart, I think probably the morally right thing to do is to take them out. But in my heart, I kind of would like to see the leadership class of this country learn that the sort of leftist governance that they have been touting and permitting, what happens when it finally takes over? Because I do think it's going to be a violent disaster.
Well, that's just the question, Joe. When you look at this, a city that's essentially stopped governing itself in some aspects, the president weighed in on all this, asking for Jay Inslee, the governor, and the mayor to take back the city. He says, take back your city now. If you don't do it, I will. This isn't a game. These ugly anarchists must be stooped, typo there, immediately move fast. Well, the mayor writes back within the hour and says, make us all safe, go back to your bunker. And then an hour after that, the governor writes and says, a man who is totally incapable of governing should stay out of Washington state's business. Stoop tweeting. So, Joe, Should they be left to their own devices? Because we talked about this yesterday, the difference between the federal government's position and the state's government. These are elected officials who are asking for no help from Trump. So should they just be left to their own devices in the city to play out?
Now, certainly the state and the city should be left to figure out what to do about this. I mean, certainly they have to take those 6 blocks or whatever it is back sooner or later. But, you know, we had a similar situation in the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge a few years ago, except it was from the far right, not the far left. And that went on for 6 weeks. Heavily armed people who had taken over federal land. And I did not hear Republicans or anybody else calling for, you know, enormous SWAT teams to swoop in there and get them immediately. Certainly Donald Trump didn't say anything about it. There was a long negotiation. It failed. It finally ended in police action against them. One person was killed, unfortunately. But, you know, it went on for almost 2 months before anything was done to put an end to it because people were trying to find a peaceful solution. And I think it would be better to have a peaceful solution to this. I don't condone the takeover of public property by any group that isn't duly constituted. And I wouldn't make an exception for this. But I do think the governor and the mayor ought to be able to try to figure out a solution on their own before anything is done precipitously.
You know, the thing that I think is interesting here, right, is I get we've had sit-ins before, but what's going on, according to the police chief herself, is that inside that zone, you have people being attacked, raped, brutalized. So the police isn't even, it's one thing to allow it to occur. It's another thing to sit by and know that people on the inside are being harmed, Andrew.
Yeah, it is. And I think that the big difference here between some of the right-wing insurgency is that the right doesn't tend to support right-wing insurgency. It tends to support law and order. And what has just been so amazing about the rise of this violent Antifa and likewise, I think, misguided and violent Black Lives Matter movement is how much support it is getting from our governing class. I mean, we have a mayor of Minneapolis who just sat by and watched the city burn. We have the mayor of Seattle pulling back the police. We have the governor of Seattle pretending he doesn't even know his major city is under attack. And this is the thing that's strange. And we have a media that is basically winking at this and saying that these are important, quote unquote, mostly peaceful movements, which they're not. And I think that that's what's so different about them. What's so different is that there are crazies on the right. There's just no question about that. But they tend to wind up in the comments section of blogs where the crazies on the left are actually in the media, in the academy, and to some degree in the Congress.
Yeah, I hoped we had time to really talk about how the media was covering this, and unfortunately we're out of time. Thank you guys for being here. I hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks very much.
All right, coming up, Diamond and Silk are back. They're going to give us their take on the latest antics by Antifa. And later, half a dozen black leaders met with President Trump this week. 2 of them, talk show host Wayne Dupree and former NFL player Jack Brewer, were there, and they're going to fill us in on the conversation.